November 29th, 1979. That day was New Year's Day in the Muslim world, according to the Hijri calendar. So Muslims flocked to the Kaaba to perform the first prayer of such a special day, and nearly 100,000 people prostrated themselves there. At the time of the morning prayer, after the Imam of the Kaaba, Muhammad bin Abdullah al-Sabil, led the prayer, gunfire erupted, and suddenly the place became a war zone. The holiest place for Muslims had been invaded and occupied by a large and armed group. The group of 260 men, led by Yuhayman al-Utaybi, mobilized immediately after the morning prayers, chanting the takbir while trying to close the gates of the Al-Haram Mosque and overpowering the security guards with automatic rifles and heavy weapons. Some armed activists also seized the minarets overlooking the Kaaba and high places such as Mount Qubaish, taking up positions there. Within an hour, they had taken control of the Kaaba in a shock raid. Then, their leader, Yuhayman al-Utaybi, took the microphone and introduced his brother-in-law, a young man named Muhammad al-Qahtani, as the Mahdi to the pilgrims they had captured inside, demanding allegiance to him. The occupation of the Kaaba by an armed group shocked the whole world. The activists had some demands from the Saudi Arabian regime. These demands were the cessation of relations with the West and the establishment of Islamic justice, the overthrow of the monarchy and the trial of the House of Saud, the trial of the rulers who marketed the country to the imperialists, stopping oil exports and not wasting the country's wealth, political demands such as the evacuation of the military bases of the imperialist states in Saudi Arabia, and the return of all foreign soldiers and advisors. Yuhayman thought that such an attack on the Kaaba would have a greater impact on the people and aimed to overthrow the regime in an atmosphere of instability. After the propaganda, they allowed some of the pilgrims to leave. Thus, some of the pilgrims were released, some were held captive, and some, influenced by the propaganda, took up arms and joined the activists. Thus began the resistance at the Kaaba. The leader of the rebels, Yuhayman al-Utaybi, was actually a commander in the Saudi Arabian Royal Guard Regiment for 18 years, but later resigned in 1973 in protest against the regime. Al-Utaybi believed that the Saudi regime was corrupt, too cozy with Western countries, and no longer represented Islam. He later wrote some articles and managed to build a small community of believers around him. He also sincerely believed that a young cleric named Muhammad bin Abdullah al-Qahtani, whom he met during these years and whose sister he would later marry, was the Mahdi. Eventually, they embarked on this endeavor to make their names and aspirations known. Yuhayman al-Utaybi's military background had undoubtedly served him well in planning the raid. Preparations had begun well in advance. The Kaaba had been mapped. Weapons, ammunition, and food had been secretly stored for months in cellars beneath the Kaaba that had not been used for hundreds of years, and underground tunnels leading to the city had been sealed off, making it impossible for security forces to enter the Kaaba. Although the Saudi Arabian army carried out several operations to infiltrate, they were unsuccessful and suffered many casualties. Utaybi's snipers, stationed on the minarets of Masjid al-Haram and on Mount Abu Qubais, where the Kaaba backs up, were able to track Saudi Arabian troops around the Kaaba and prevent them from getting close to their positions. Realizing they could not handle the situation on their own, the Saudis sought Pakistan's support to end the occupation. But the Pakistani special forces that arrived in the area also failed to achieve any success. In response, anti-terrorist troops were requested from France. But there was a problem. Non-Muslims were banned from entering the Kaaba, the Muslim holy site. This prohibition was solved by a fatwa issued by bin Bas, the Qadi of Mecca. The French soldiers were asked to recite the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, before arriving in Mecca, thus being recognized as Muslims. They were brought to Mecca and placed around the Kaaba. The Kaaba was under occupation for almost 2 weeks. And finally, on the night of December the 5th, the French troops launched an interesting operation. First, poisonous gases were thrown into the masjid, forcing the occupiers to flee to the lower floors. A special team wearing masks entered and took over the ground floor and upper floors of the Kaaba. For the rebels hiding in the tunnels and cellars, an unthinkable method was used. Tons of water were pumped through large pipes into the underground tunnels where the invaders were hiding. And finally, the water was electrified. As a matter of fact, this is how the 2-week occupation was ended. Of the 260 invaders, 90 died during the fighting, and 27 were wounded in hospitals, while the leader of the raid, Yuhayman al-Utaybi, was captured alive, and al-Qahtani, who claimed to be the Mahdi, was found dead. According to Saudi authorities, 127 security personnel and 26 civilians were killed, and 462 security personnel and 109 civilians were wounded during the invasion, although some sources put the number of dead and wounded much higher. Paul Baril, the French officer in charge of the Kaaba operation, later said that 7 tons of poison gas bombs were used during the operation, which killed many pilgrims trapped or held captive in the Kaaba. A Jordanian official, however, stated that the death toll was much higher than what the Saudi authorities had reported, claiming that around 5,000 people had been killed. Yuhayman al-Utaybi and 143 other invaders, who were tried and sentenced to death according to Sharia law, were killed in 8 different cities in Saudi Arabia, first by cutting off their arms, then their legs, and finally their heads. But the reasons for the incident, which began on November 20th, 1979, and who was behind it, have never been clarified. It was covered up by the Saudi authorities, and the case was closed.